And I will add another benefit. If anyone is on dating apps in Los Angeles, or you're in a relationship with someone who, I had several friends who we all lived in different parts of LA, and we never saw each other when we were in LA because it's like, oof, that's a trip. You're 8 miles away, but, I'll catch you when we're both home for the holidays. Or you're like, I'm swiping left because you live in Marina Del Rey and I'm never going to see you again. Everybody, if you pay for your roads, it'll be easier to date. And you can put that in your next paper, of course. That's free.
The abstract is already written.
Awesome. Hello, everybody. You're listening to That Can't Be Right, a podcast about exploring structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. As always, I am your host, Ryan Rogan. If you aren't already, follow TCBR Pod on Twitter and Instagram. I'm very funny, and there are lots of good pictures of my dog. 2, like and subscribe to That Can't Be Right wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening, you have figured out how to get podcasts, and just keep going back to that source. That's enough of the very boring things we have to do every episode. Today, my guest is going to help, I think, a lot of people, because you might be listening to this in traffic right now, and he might have an explanation for you. Mike Manville is an associate professor of urban planning at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. His research and teaching focus on the relationship between transportation and land use. And Mike was a recommendation from a listener. So if you want to make a recommendation, you too can contribute to the success of That Can't Be Right. But for now, Mike, welcome to That Can't Be Right.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is exciting. Mike, you look like a well-read man. No one else can see you, but I can see you. What's something in the last few days, a headline, a conversation with friends, that you're like, wow, that can't be right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I read something in the last few days, and I wasn't sure. It didn't quite say that can't be right, so maybe this won't count. But what did come to my mind was, I wonder if that's right. And there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly about the University of California's decision to stop using the SAT. And the article was very against this decision and suggested that the SAT was actually a pretty important way for students from some disadvantaged school districts to get into the UC. And had a number, I forget what the number was, of students who had basically been able to test in even though their high schools weren't very good and things like that. And then, like a lot of people who've made bad decisions in life, I have a Twitter account. And so then this was like on Twitter and people were saying it was wrong. And I honestly have no idea. But I am an employee of the UC. We don't, as you may know, at the Luskin School, we don't have that many undergrads. We have some now. So I've never really given this a ton of thought, although I give it more thought now. So I do wonder what the story is there. I know that it's been a big controversy, but what are the pros and cons of the SAT? It sounded wrong to me that it was really important, but I honestly I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I didn't see that article, but I have seen, of course, I've made also the wrong decision to spend a lot of time on Twitter. And I don't know, there's always a lot of discourse when things like that happen.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not equitable because there are people that can afford private tutors who can teach you all the tips and tricks, people who can afford to study, people who can't. It's supposed to be an equalizer. Is it really? Good. Thank you very much for sharing.
And yeah, as someone who doesn't know much about it, each argument is plausible. So I just don't know, right? I just don't know.
That's fair. And that's everybody. That's always an option. If you don't know, you don't have to have an opinion on it until you do your research. You can save your opinion in your drafts. You can put it in the group chat, which is a safe space. There are options, but thank you for sharing that. Like I said, that was a really good one, and that could be worthy of an episode in and of itself.
Cool.
Thank you. Again, everybody else doing the work for me, like a good group project. So, let's talk about it. I wanted to chat with you because my friend said, you know something about traffic patterns. And I spent 6 years in LA, 4 years making the commute on the 405, doing the 101 405 interchange.
Oh.
I know.
That's a bad one.
Yeah, I liked the Valley, but I worked in Santa Monica. So, lessons learned. To start, and we'll dive into this, but why does traffic in LA suck so bad? And why does it suck beyond just like typical rush hour times?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to answer that question. And one answer is just traffic is bad in almost every large urban area in the country, right? So, people in LA say, oh my God, the traffic's terrible. I grew up in Boston. If I go back to Boston, people in Boston say, oh my God, the traffic's terrible. And when people, there are agencies and institutions out there that try to measure how bad the congestion is. And I think there's always a pretty big, grain of salt that you have to take these rankings with, even though they get a lot of attention. But, what happens is some of your bigger metropolitan areas always trade off the number one spot each year. So LA is often considered the most congested urbanized area in the country. But, some years it's Washington, D.C., some years it's Boston. The question of why it is so awful, to the extent it's worse than, the misery that you might find yourself in trying to get in and out of Washington, D.C. or in and out of New York. I think one reason that people perceive it as much worse is that it's a big city that doesn't offer something a lot of other big cities do, which is the opportunity for a lot of people to escape the traffic, right? So traffic is terrible in New York City, but the average resident of New York City doesn't experience it that much because they do have the option not to drive, right? And so what happens is they walk a lot, or they ride the subway, which flows along pretty fast beneath a terribly clogged street. And so Los Angeles has, and the same thing is true to a lesser extent of Boston and Chicago and Washington and other places that also have terrible traffic. So one thing that makes Los Angeles stand out, particularly to people who've lived in a couple different urbanized areas, is just that you have this awful traffic, and you will be a part of it, right? So Los Angeles is, and this is related in part to another thing that makes Los Angeles as an urbanized area kind of unique. So if you look at the way that Chicago or New York or Washington, D.C. are laid out, they have a very dense city, a center city, and then the suburbs are actually not very dense, right? If you, like Westchester County in New York, is pretty low density. And if you just go a little ways up the Hudson River out of Manhattan, it's like downright bucolic, right? There's these big parks, and it's lovely. And the same thing is true for Boston and Chicago as well. And Los Angeles is different. Los Angeles is actually, on average, denser than all those urbanized areas. Like if you just average out the whole, but it's just this very consistent medium density is what does it, right? So it's just, New York looks like, for lack of a better term, it looks like Hong Kong surrounded by Phoenix, right? It's just like super dense in the middle, and then it's pretty low density.
Yes.
And Los Angeles just looks like Los Angeles surrounded by Los Angeles. And that has a consequence. Like the suburbs of Los Angeles are, over 80% as dense as the center city. And that's in part because the suburbs are dense, and in part because the center city isn't very dense compared to other big cities. That does something to our transportation system, right? What it does basically is that it means that the region is dense enough to have terrible traffic and not dense enough to really meaningfully support other ways of moving around. Right? So it's only in a few parts of our region do we get the kind of density we would need to really have a high-performing rail system to have these sort of really nice walkable neighborhoods. And we can talk a little bit about that because in some ways LA sort of shoots itself in the foot. Not to beat this to death, but let me just give you one last way of thinking about this. If you live in Westchester County in New York, then when you're in your suburban life, you can drive around and the driving's actually pretty nice because there just aren't that many people. And then when you have to go into the city for work, you can hop on a train, and the train works pretty well because New York City is so dense and it's very supportive of that. And LA is sort of trapped between those two extremes. There's no place where driving is nice, and there's no place where transit works really well. And so that's a recipe for everyone who has to go everywhere, always using the road. And that makes for terrible congestion.
I have two questions, and it might actually just be one question. Is how did LA develop in such a way where it's very accurate that LA is pretty dense almost everywhere. There's not a ton of places where it's like, oh, this is like a real suburb I'm getting to.
Right.
How did that happen? And I think that kind of leads my other question is, how did LA shoot itself in the foot? So I'm thinking you're going to answer, those answers are tied together.
They're a little bit tied together. And so, I mean, topography matters here too, to a certain extent. That, part of the reason our roads get congested as well, you mentioned that you would come over from the valley. So LA is also somewhat unique in American cities in having a mountain range cut through it, right? And so when that happens, getting over that range means you funnel all the traffic into some passes, Sepulveda Pass and so forth. And so those are always going to be congested to a certain extent because all the traffic is going to have to come through there somehow. Excuse me. The reason LA developed differently than these other cities, I think in part is just a matter of timing, which is to say that a much larger share of Los Angeles was built after widespread adoption of the automobile, right? So I think that, and again, I grew up in the Northeast. I think those cities are great, but there's, from a transportation perspective, people in Boston and New York and so forth kind of pat themselves on the back a little bit, like, oh yeah, we have all this public transit and these, people out in California, they're just driving around, and that's true. But it's these were what we see in Boston and New York and so forth. These were accidents of history, right? Those cities developed around first walking and then rail. And then those development patterns stayed in place. I mean, they did have the wisdom or the good luck not to knock all those buildings over. But almost every part of the country that has been developed since widespread adoption of the car looks like LA to a certain extent. What happened in LA is that so many people wanted to live here that we reached a density that made that development pattern unsustainable, but we didn't change it. Right? So the typical suburb, someone laid it out and said, well, let's just have, one house on, quarter acre lot and, wide streets, and it'll be lovely. And that if it doesn't grow, that works. But of course, LA has grown and grown and grown. And what should have happened from a just sort of economic efficiency standpoint is like, okay, well, some of these low density neighborhoods should have been taken down and redeveloped at higher density, and that should have enabled us to think about better ways of moving around or alternative ways of moving around. And we didn't do that for a lot of reasons, but part of it's just the human nature of people don't like change. People move into a neighborhood of single family homes. They don't like the idea of that becoming a different type of neighborhood. And so LA has become a sort of globally significant city that has retained the built environment of a suburb. And it just doesn't work very well.
Yeah, I think that sentence will probably be our marketing clip. So that works perfectly.
All right.
I have more follow-up questions from that. I was only able to read the abstracts from some of your articles, but it's essentially that a lot of, well, maybe not a lot, but some of those decisions are happening at the ballot box. Like, people are voting, so you can't redevelop or you can't add multifamily housing. How has that, or in what ways has that taken shape, or what are some really significant decisions and consequences of those decisions? And then how come, or why, rather, aren't cities listening to smart people like you that say, hey, we can fix this if we make these changes?
I think one of the reasons our congestion problem and the various problems associated with our sort of reliance on automobiles exclusively or almost exclusively, it persists because on some level, the way everyone wants to change it is that they want everyone else to start doing something different, right? So the ideal solution to the congestion problem for the typical person sitting on the 405 is that everyone else stops driving, right? And so, and if you talk to voters, about, or survey them or whatever, about like building trains, the idea that they are really drawn to is like, oh yeah, we build the train and then a bunch of these people get out of my way and my driving's going to be easier. But of course, if everyone thinks that way, you can build a train and then no one will get on it because they're waiting for someone else to get on it. And I think what's happened is we have installed the car as the one normal way to get around, right? To such an extent that we now want to solve car-related problems in ways that don't ask drivers to change their behavior, right? It is a political third rail to say, I know we all hate this traffic congestion. And the only way we're going to solve it is if we actually do something to make you drive a little bit less, right? It is much more appealing to say, oh, we're going to get some money from somewhere, right? And somehow make a little more room on the roads, right? And that's what that is it dangles the prospect of a better commute, of a better transportation system without asking anyone who is currently sitting in congestion to do anything differently. And the reason that will never work is because if you are in congestion, you are causing congestion, right? That's, unless you happen to be stuck on a bus or something. And so what we do is we say, well, we're going to build this train, we're going to widen this road, and we've been doing this for decades now. So Los Angeles, of course, has widened its roads many times over. I mean, the 405 in some places is 16 lanes wide, right? The 405, when you drive down, at its widest level is just a testament, right, to the idea that some lessons are simply unlearnable. Right? Because people are just like, oh, well, this time, if we make it 18 lanes, we're going to solve the traffic. No, of course not. That's not the way traffic works. And we voted 4 or 5 times to allocate more funding for our mass transit system. And every time, a major selling point of that transit system has been, this is going to reduce traffic congestion. And so I think what has happened is, for political reasons, and they're understandable political reasons, we have refrained from telling people what it will actually take to reduce congestion. And so as a result, we keep doing things that don't work, and we get into this bad cycle where, now no one really trusts anyone when they talk about traffic. There's a tremendous cynicism about the entire field of transportation planning, and it's because we feel the need to perpetuate this fiction that the cause of congestion is something other than the typical person. When they get in the car, they want to drive. And until at least some of them decide not to do that, we're going to have traffic.
So I usually save the solution till the end, but there's so much to talk about. So I'm going to just jump into it right now. What will it actually take to reduce congestion?
If you want to reduce traffic congestion in Los Angeles or in any other large urbanized area where traffic is a problem, you need to price your roads. This is the unpleasant, bitter medicine that no one wants to take, which leads them to swallow all sorts of snake oil instead. Snake oil like we should widen the highway. Snake oil like if you build a subway, there won't be traffic. Snake oil like Elon Musk saying that he's just going to build 2,000 miles of subterranean tunnels and that will solve it. Most of us understand in the broader world that if you have some good or service that lots of people want and you give it away for free, pretty soon you will run out of it, right? We understand that that's why on Black Friday, it's the only time you see Best Buy and Target running out of stuff. They're like holding down the price of things people want. We understand on some level that if someone said, my new proposal is to abolish electric meters, we would have blackouts in the summer. We understand that if, the state of California passed a law that said all gasoline would now be free, we would have gas stations with empty pumps. We suspend that understanding when we think about the roads. But if you think about what the roads are, they're just this incredibly valuable network of land that gives us access to places we want to go, right? The 405 is just a huge piece of land in Southern California. Land in Southern California is really valuable. It's even more valuable at those times when many people have to go somewhere, so like at rush hour. And so what happens every morning on the 405 is not, from an economic perspective, surprising at all. You have a huge amount of demand for this good. You have a limited supply of it. You do not mediate that demand with a price, and so you get a shortage. And that's all congestion is. It's this gigantic, slowly moving shortage of road space that because we don't charge for that road space with money, everybody has to pay in time. Many people have to pay in pollution costs, and we pay in crashes as well. And so economists have said this for many years, but for many years it wasn't technologically feasible, but that if you wanted to not have shortages of road, you would charge the users of the road a toll to get on it, and that toll would be higher when more people wanted to use the road and lower when fewer people wanted to use the road. And so you could imagine that the toll might be a couple bucks at 8 in the morning on the 405, and it might be nothing at midnight on the 405, right? There's very little demand. But that idea of a toll that varies to make the road perform well is what we call congestion pricing.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing else will work.
Okay.
And that's the most important message. Nothing else will work.
I've read some of your articles and you've addressed all of these objections, but I know people listening will be like, but what about? So let's do the but what abouts.
Yeah.
I already pay taxes. Isn't that enough?
You do already pay taxes, but the difference between a tax and a charge is that, like a congestion charge, is that your taxes are not directly related to your decision to use the road, right? And so what your gas taxes do, for instance, is that they raise money to provide the road, to make sure it gets built, hopefully to get rid of potholes and so forth. But the gas tax isn't really a tax on driving, right? It's a tax on burning gas. And so you could pay a lot of gas tax and not drive at all if you just got a Hummer and just left it running in your driveway. You could drive a lot and not pay the gas tax if you bought a Tesla, right? And so again, I guess the analogy here again is like nobody says to the electric company, I already pay an income tax. Why are you metering my electricity? Right? And it's because we understand that one thing the electric meter is doing is it's making sure nobody sort of wastefully uses electricity and puts the whole network at risk. And the reason that works is because every time you turn on the lights, you start getting charged. Because we don't do that with driving on our most desirable roads, we do run out.
Perfect. Next. And this will come, I think, from mostly people who don't actually care about poor people. But
right.
What about poor people? Oh, it's not fair. I'm so concerned about poor people in my mansion in Brentwood.
Right. And of course, sometimes, as you say, that's quite insincere, but it is a completely legitimate concern. And the one thing to say right off the bat is that in almost any metropolitan area, the very poorest people don't drive. Right, they're on buses they're being slowed down by congestion. In almost any metropolitan area, the poorest people also disproportionately are affected by pollution from congested roads. Right, if you look at the people who live within 1,000, 2,000 feet of these busy freeways, where the particulate matter and the benzene and the carbon monoxide are most intense, they tend to be lower income and often lower income people of color. So there's huge costs, huge fairness costs to the way we do things right now as well. That said, it's absolutely the case that, in a place like Los Angeles and in many other metropolitan areas, a lot of lower income people do drive, and some of them might have a hard time paying these tolls. Well, congestion pricing, fortunately, comes with a built-in solution to that problem because you're going to raise a lot of money. And it is absolutely true that you should take some of that money and one way or another use it to sort of protect people who are below a certain income, right? That could be in the form of rebates. It could be in the form of sort of they get a preloaded transponder each month that has a certain amount of money in there to take care of their essential travel. But it's, again, there's a lot of things in the country, unfortunately, that lower income people have a hard time affording. It is very unusual that we solve that problem by saying, well, then that good should be free for everybody, right? Like when people have a hard time affording food, we do not say all groceries are free for everybody who walks in the store, right? What we say is we need a program like SNAP, food stamps, right? That helps some low income people, and it could be more generous for sure, but helps some people buy some food. It is a very strange approach to equity to say, I'm worried that some low-income people might have a hard time affording driving. Therefore, all the roads should always be free for everyone. Because if you really believe that, where does it stop? I mean, shouldn't all gas be free for everyone? Shouldn't all cars be free for everyone? So it's none of this is to diminish the fact that if you were going to put a program in like this, you would have to worry about equity, right? But it's not an insurmountable problem.
Excellent. And I think at the end you made a great point. It's what I've noticed in the pandemic, and I'm sure has always been present, but I've been privileged enough to not be touched by it, is that there's always a limit to how much you want to help people or how much institutions want to help people. We can't help them too much. And
Right.
then like you're saying, this is the opposite. We've made it free for everybody. But again, there's ways to subsidize it if a plan was to be implemented.
Yeah, and I think there's a broader issue here, which is just when people don't have enough money, and unfortunately in our country, a lot of people don't have enough money, the way to help them is to give them money, right? It's that's the thing that's most proven to do it, because again, there's a lot of low-income people who don't drive, and just saying the road's free doesn't help them. But some cash in their pocket could. Right. So in many ways, when we just try and hold prices down for everybody, not only do we get sort of a bad government service, because the roads are a terrible service right now, we don't help people very well either. We're sort of taking the easy way out.
Definitely. And I'll do one last, but what about? But the government needs to mind their business while I'm driving, and this is going to be terribly implemented, and it's going to cause more traffic, and I'm angry.
Well, so, I mean, there's always, whenever someone proposes a program, there's always an argument they're going to do it badly. And there's not much to say to that other than well, if you just assume it's going to go terribly, then it's going to go terribly, right? I mean, it's sort of, but I do think, because other places have done this, Singapore has done it, London has done a version of it, we can learn a little bit from those places and roll it out in a way that may not have too many hiccups. I do think this can be done, right? And I think we have examples of it, both in sort of some of the fast track lanes we have in the United States, in international examples. It will not create more traffic, right? Absolutely, it will not. There's really no evidence to suggest that it will. And one thing it will do is it will make the road actually work, right? I mean, people sometimes think of this as an anti-driving policy, right? Because suddenly the driver is going to be charged. But it's really important to remember that the price here is a behavioral signal that actually makes the road function. It gets rid of this chronic shortage of roads that we have experienced for 70 years. And in that way, it is one of the most pro-driving policies you can imagine, right? So this congestion pricing really is a win-win because you're going to get less driving overall, right? You're going to get less congestion. You're going to get less pollution. But the driving you have is going to be amazing, right? Because you're not going to be worried that getting from the valley to Santa Monica will suddenly take you 90 minutes because something went terribly wrong. Arguing that a price, charging a price to use the road makes you anti-driving is like saying that Starbucks, because it charges a price for its coffee, is anti-coffee, right? Or that Exxon is anti-oil because it charges for it. No, I mean, these are what should stand out to us is that the one network utility we have in the United States that is completely free, that is not charged for. So that's the roads. Like, compare that with your water, your electricity, your heating fuel, is also the one that most consistently disappoints us. The one that we can rely on the least. And as a result of that, our urban areas are just less than the sum of their parts. Los Angeles is this amazing place where in a span of 11 miles, you can be at the beach, you can be in a big urban downtown, and then you can be in a 6,000-foot mountain. And so few people take advantage of that because the idea of making that 11-mile trip is so daunting because the roads suck so bad. And the pricing could get rid of that. It would be this is a place where you want the government in your business, right? The government has been delivering you subpar roads for decades, and it's time they got their act together and gave you a service that we can all appreciate. But to do that, they have to charge for it. And
I will add another benefit. If anyone is on dating apps in Los Angeles, or you're in a relationship with someone I had several friends we all lived in different parts of LA, and we never saw each other when we were in LA because it's like, oof, that's a trip. You're 8 miles away, but I'll catch you when we're both home for the holidays. Or you're like, I'm swiping left because you live in Marina Del Rey and I'm never going to see you again. Right. Everybody, if you pay for your roads, it'll be easier to date. And you can put that in your next paper, of course. That's free. The abstract is already written. Perfect. I have a couple more questions. Sure. Mostly kind of about the implementation and things like that, and maybe the future. Of course, we have to address the variant in the room of COVID. That'll be the last thing. You mentioned there are cities internationally that are doing this. You mentioned that lots of major U.S. cities have toll roads. Where do the efforts stand to do something like this in LA or in any other major U.S. cities? So New York, for a long time, this one was going nowhere in the United States. And I think, the reason for that is understandable in the sense that in many places that overseas that had adopted it, those places had much stronger transit systems and a far greater share of people who already weren't driving a lot. And so politically, it was easier. So politically, it's always been very hard in the United States. But New York, right before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, did approve a form of congestion pricing to enter Manhattan. The implementation was delayed, of course, by the pandemic, but they are still planning to do that. There's a number of other cities that are studying some version of it. LA is one of them. Seattle is studying it. San Francisco is studying it. Boston has made some noises about studying it. But it's, I've studied this for a long time. I'm a big proponent of it, but I'm not going to be naive. It is a politically very hard lift. And so the progress, if you look at the progress that has been made, you can say, oh, wow, this is pretty exciting. But the fact of the matter is it's going slowly, and it's going very slowly, especially when you consider that every place that has done it, it's worked and they've kept it. It's just it's just not very contagious. Yeah. And I think that kind of leads to my next question, the objectors. Who are the actors on the back end that are maybe you shouldn't study this. Why don't you study new headlights instead? Is the manufacturers? Is it? No, I think really the big concerns come from, so for a long time, AAA was a staunch opponent. And I may be misreading this. I feel like they're softening a bit, but they have always, and this is again, what I think is a really misguided position on their part, because I think if you really are advocating for
the rights of automobile users, you should really like a policy that is going to make the roads much more reliable. But I think the way they have always seen it is they protect road users from charges, right? And that's, I'm not a huge driver, but sure, if you're a lobbyist for automobile users, I can understand you're taking positions against various registration fees and gas taxes and so forth. But even within that position, a fee that would actually make the roads more reliable, I think is something you should be in favor of. And to their credit, at least the Southern California AAA seems to be coming around. The other opposition, I think, comes from two sources, and this is what makes it hard. One is just like the general populace is suspicious of this. It's for a long time, the roads have been free and we've been accustomed to it. And then also for a long time, and my brethren and I of urban planners are somewhat to blame for this, we have told the public that there are other ways to do this. Right. We have told them that it's about road widening. We've told them that it's about more transit. And just as an aside, many places in the country do need more transit. Transit can do a world of good things. It just can't fix the roads. Right. Transit's super important. And so as a result, when we come to them and say, actually, you know what we have to do? We have to price your roads and reach into your pocketbook to make sure this works. They very understandably turn around and say, you weren't saying that 5 years ago. You told me that if I just helped you build a subway, everything would be fine, right? So this is one of the, it's a big thing in public policy of credibility. That if you say something to a group of voters, you better mean it because they might remember it, right? Mm-hmm. And so as a result of that, you also have elected officials who are incredibly risk averse, and not willing to. They would much rather talk about getting some money from Washington, D.C. to expand a light rail line than talk about pricing the roads.
I guess I did have a question about this, but it comes to mind now that you mentioned D.C. There's been a lot of talk about the infrastructure bill, trillions of dollars. The money that falls under your area of expertise, do you think that money is going to be allocated well? Do you think?
So, I'd be lying to you if I said I'd have really, I've followed this debate and I've been reading the paper, but I haven't been being a junkie about it. Mm-hmm. But so let me just make a kind of broader statement. Our infrastructure does need a lot of work, right? And a lot of the money that could be spent well is money that would be used to just shore up infrastructure that's in bad physical shape, right? Mm-hmm. Anyone who's driven in Los Angeles knows that oftentimes the roads are just real beat up. That's not safe. It's not good for the environment. It does things to the tire pressure and the fuel efficiency and so forth. It leads to more pollution. So money that just sort of fixes up roads and bridges that are undermining performance, etc., that's money well spent. I think that once you start talking about the roads as a system that need to perform better, right? Like to ease congestion, to get then the infrastructure bill becomes an excellent example of a very profound misunderstanding that we've sort of talked about a little bit thus far, which is that for the roads to perform better, they need to collect revenue. They don't need revenue given to them, right? Mm-hmm. What's going to make a road work better is not that we spend money on it, but that we ask people to spend money to be on it, right? Because fundamentally, the problem is the allocation of this scarce space that is Sepulveda Boulevard or the 405 or Route 93 in Boston. And you can't throw money at that problem. You can throw money at that problem if there's a giant pothole on it, right? But if the problem is there's too many people who want to get on this road, then you have to actually collect money from those people. And that's not something a congressional bill can do. And so it's entirely appropriate for us to make a huge investment, I think, in national infrastructure. It's entirely appropriate to identify roads that are just in bad physical shape and get them up to par. We're a rich country. We should have nice roads. And the same thing's true with our transit systems, right? It's ridiculous that it takes so long for the Amtrak to go from Washington to New York. Let's put some money into that. But when people in Congress start talking about we're going to spend money on this freeway system and physically fix it up so that it has less congestion, that's just not right. And it's not right in this, it's not some moral sense. It's just not right in a like 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. Like that's not what's going to solve that problem.
Excellent. So let's look forward a little bit more, and then we will wrap it up.
Sounds good.
On a micro level, some cities, some communities have made changes to their infrastructure based on needs for COVID to increase the outdoor space, or people weren't traveling as much. Any thoughts on whether or not those changes are net positive, will remain in place, once the world has run through the Greek alphabet of COVID variants?
Yeah. Assuming we're not all dead from the Zeta variant in 20 years, right? Yeah, I think on net, those are very positive developments, and the devil's always in the details, exactly how the decision's made, and so on and so forth. But as a general rule, one of the lesser appreciated costs of our inability to deal with congestion is the fact that because we don't address it, squarely by pricing the roads, we've addressed it like so inefficiently. Well, I guess here's what I'm trying to say. The typical American city has allocated way too much space to cars, right? And in part because it has this obsession with traffic congestion, an obsession that doesn't, unfortunately, include the one solution that would make congestion better. And so we have all these rules that, if you build a restaurant, you have to have a huge parking lot. If you build an apartment building, that needs a big parking lot. If you increase the density of a housing development, you have to widen the street and add a left turn lane. And, all these things are things that at the moment they're being done on that parcel, you can talk yourself into the idea that they're reasonable. But when you add it all up over decades and over many parcels, you have this city that's just like huge amounts of space are just pavement. And that, it doesn't do much to reduce congestion. And even if it did, there is more to the world, and in fact, more to the world of transportation than just how congested the road is for drivers. And so taking back some of that space, I think is a great idea, COVID or not, right? To just make so many of our streets more human-scaled, more open to more types of interaction. It's always been a strange aspect of Los Angeles that this place with such wonderful weather had relatively little outdoor dining. And one reason it had relatively little outdoor dining is that by law, you had to devote so much of your restaurant parcel to parking. And, my neighborhood in West Hollywood has been sort of modestly transformed by these restaurants that have put some turf down on their parking lot. Now they have these like wonderful outdoor dining areas. And I think it does a lot of things, right? And one, because the parking lots are often bigger than the restaurants. The restaurants actually can serve more people. But the other thing is that, when you have a street that is basically a bunch of buildings with parking around them, you don't have a street that's very friendly to walking, right? You have a street where people drive directly to the destination, and then they get in their car when they're done and they drive away. And as they drive away, they cross out of a driveway, they go across the sidewalk, and that's a little bit dangerous for anyone who does happen to be on the sidewalk. And once you start to change that, you set in motion a chain of events where it's like, oh, well, there's no parking structure now. There's no parking lot now at that restaurant, so I'll walk to the restaurant. Well, now you're on the street. And because there's no parking lot, the sidewalk actually feels a little safer because you don't have vehicles sliding in and out. And then because you're actually walking to the restaurant from your house and back, you're going to pause and look in the window of some other store, some other restaurant that before you would have been driving by at 30 miles an hour. And now you're going to poke your head in there. And people on the street breeds people on the street, right? And you're going to one thing we've done with our transportation planning over many decades is just slowly evacuate everything from our streets but car traffic. And that makes for a very utilitarian and unpleasant street. And as we can take space away from cars, and that's not banning cars, it's not saying you can't drive, it's just maybe Beverly Boulevard doesn't have to be 6 lanes wide. As you reintroduce bicycles and people walking and so forth, you get a different sort of street, and it can remind us all that there was a time when like the purpose of having a city was something other than just driving through it, right? And I think it's a nice change.
One last forward-looking question. This one is a little more long-term.
Okay.
The Olympics. LA is hosting the Olympics in 2028. We're recording middle of the 2020-2021 Olympics happening in Tokyo. Circumstances have made it such that traffic isn't a huge concern for them.
Right.
But how do you anticipate that LA will be able to manage traffic 7 years from now?
If you go back to 1984 when LA had the Olympics, this was a huge concern then too, right? And what the city basically did is it just urged everyone to stay home. And a lot of businesses sort of cooperated by closing during that time. And the traffic was actually, they held it together for 10 days, and the traffic was actually not too bad. Probably you could do that again. And, this is assuming we don't have congestion pricing by then or something like that. And I think, it would be reminiscent, I think, of back in 2011 when they did work on the 405 and they had this thing called Carmageddon. There was this they're going to have to close the 405 for a weekend. And so Metro and Caltrans, started months ahead of time just saying, like, please, on this weekend, stay home, don't drive. And for the most part, people did, right? And the traffic was, like, remarkably... And so, you can... When you have a relatively short period of time, you can get buy-in from people in big institutions to cooperate and not, and hold the traffic down. Well, you couldn't do it for a whole year, but you might be able to do it for 8 days. The thing to remember about that is that implies a huge economic cost, right? Just like a bunch of people not going places they might want to go, a bunch of people not shopping, a bunch of businesses, maybe being closed or having people work a little less efficiently from home. And we should remember that when people talk about the economic boon of the Olympics, right? That what you're getting is a bunch of people coming to LA, sure, spending some money, filling up the hotels, but you have to subtract away the fact that all other life is sort of grinding to a halt. And when that happens, especially because, like, I can't, other than the pandemic, it's hard to imagine another July when all the hotels in Los Angeles weren't full anyways. It's not like people have never come to Los Angeles to visit. I mean, so it's just there's a tendency to subtract, to add up all the economic benefits, quote unquote, of the Olympics, and then forget to subtract away the various things we all have to do to adjust to them, right? And of course there's, there's big sort of high ticket concerns about displacement and so forth, which are very real. But there's also just like, if we deal with the traffic by asking everyone not to travel, like, that's going to add up to millions of dollars right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see. Maybe congestion pricing will be in place, and
that would be the ideal, right?
Yeah.
People would still be able to get where they have to go. People could move between these venues. I mean, probably not for this podcast, but if it was up to me, we would not be having the Olympics here. But I think that's probably a done deal. So
yeah. Hey, that could be another episode. Right. So that's it on LA traffic. We've gotten to the root cause. We've identified the solution, and we've talked about what it looks like, what LA might look like going forward. Thank you for all of that. This is
Thank you.
A new part of That Can't Be Right. Mike has been tipped off. We talked about something in the news that he saw recently that can't be right. We've mentioned the Olympics, whether or not they should be in LA. That's another subject we can explore.
True, yeah.
But again, the hook of this show is structural wrongs, cultural oddities, and wild opinions. So is there a long-standing structural wrong, cultural oddity, or wild opinion that you think can't be right that should be an episode after your episode airs?
Well, I guess I mentioned the one before about the SAT. I think that's, but I like I said, I'm not sure how wrong that is. I just don't know what the story is there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been. Well, yeah, okay. I'll dip into my other the other half of my research. Home ownership.
Yes.
It's we've turned it into something in this country that makes people, all else equal, kind of antisocial, right? Because they're so worried about it as a wealth building asset that they become a little suspicious of having neighbors. They prefer not to see different types of housing and different types of people near them, and it's a tough nut to crack because there's a lot of things to like about the idea of owning your own home, right? I mean, you can paint the walls, you can, whatever, to give the dog his own room.
Yep. Or a yard. But, really, that's my goal right now.
Yeah, that's right. And the fact is that you could conceivably rent a home with a yard, but most homes with yards are for owner sale, right? It's very hard to rent I've done it once in my life, and my dog loved it. But it's hard to find. And so, yeah, I think there's a structural wrong in the way we have approached homeownership, because we, on the one hand, tell people this is your asset and this is how you're going to build wealth. But housing can only be an asset, or it can only be a good asset for wealth building if it's scarce. And when housing's scarce, that means other people have a hard time getting shelter. And that is a structural tension in the way we approach homeownership that, unless we resolve it, a lot of our metropolitan areas are going to stay really unaffordable.
100%. I am a classic millennial in that I spend a lot of my spare time when I'm not on Twitter looking at homes I can't afford on Zillow. And
so it's a fine hobby.
It's a great hobby, but I mean, to all of your points, I'm looking at places where I don't share a wall, where I do have space for my dog, where I do have outdoor space, where if I'm stuck at home for another 18 months, like, I won't want to murder the people I live with. And at the same time, it does create that tension. Do I want to go in a neighborhood where it's cheap now because I will be a gentrifier? Or do I go into a neighborhood where there's nobody else that looks like me? And it's great. It's great.
Yeah, and I think and there's I mean, it's a very, obviously, like any big problem, there's a lot of facets to it. But I think one of the things that would really help is if we it's this connection, like, if there was a better way to help people understand that they're going to be okay for their future and they're going to have something for their children, right? Then, and no one likes change, right? I mean, I'm not saying that if you did this, the proposed fourplex in the single family neighborhood, everybody would be like, oh yeah, no problem. But it would be easier. I think and I think a lot of people don't understand on some level, like, if all you want to do if what you really want to do is sort of ensure your retirement and your kids, that, you should just open a Vanguard index. Like, a home is just this, like, crazy volatile investment.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a home is a nice thing to own if you want to own a home. But if you just want to watch your wealth grow, like, there's so many better things you could do, and we've done a terrible job educating people about that. Like, people just grow up and they're like, if you're renting, you're just throwing money away, and you need to own a home. And it's like, well, that's crazy. I mean, It's true that if you pay rent, you don't own the property, but, like, by that logic, every time I buy food, I'm throwing money away. I don't own Whole Foods. But, like, you know what? It's important to me to eat.
Yeah. No, it's, again, having the same conversations with my friends, my peers. It's like, what do we do? And an episode on homeownership is forthcoming, and this will add a new wrinkle to that conversation.
Good.
Just the understanding that if it's all about, like, holding an asset, there are different ways to do that. And again, education always presents one, maybe two paths forward, like, college or the military, as opposed to a lot of different ways. So there's that component that's missing. But I have taken up so much of Mike's time, so we are going to call it here. Everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to That Can Be Right. Mike, do you have anything you want to promote? Do you want to tell people your Twitter handle?
Oh, yeah. Sure. I have a Twitter handle. It's mmanville6.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Perfect. I will include the link in the episode description. Make sure if you have any other questions or if you are a congestion pricing objector, you can let me know at TCBRpod on Twitter, Instagram. Make sure to leave 5 stars on this interview. And if you're listening to this and you're on the 405, on the 101, on the 5, the 110, on Sepulveda, on Will, I don't know. If you're in LA listening to this, I'm praying for you. I am. And now you know, the problem isn't the idiot next to you who didn't use their blinker. The problem is, or the solution is, congestion pricing.